Have you ever sat in that heavy silence at a family dinner? Here on Tales of Home, we retell those moments honest every day, sometimes controversial. Every story is a mirror. Subscribe, join the conversation, and maybe find a little healing. In the gray hush before the service, Kansas City felt pared to bone. Fog draped the girders of the Broadway Bridge and St. Mark's. Episcopal sat within it like a ship at anchor. I buttoned Victor Blake's charcoal overcoat, my hands working a ritual they had learned over 40 years, and climbed the stone steps. The cuff still held his cloned cedar and pepper as if memory could be a temperature. Inside, the nave smelled of beeswax and old hymnals. I kept moving the way a person does when motion is the only defense against being seen too clearly. I did not take a front pew. I chose the side aisle end seat, close enough to be dutiful and far enough to be overlooked. The bulletin was thick stock embossed with a small cross. It felt like something expensive that did not belong to me. The pew creaked when I sat, a small, embarrassed sound. The choir tried a chord. An organ note followed, testing the rafters. Stained glass shadows landed in rectangles across the tile and folded over my shoes. I tucked a packet of tissues beneath the hymn rack where hands might reach without searching. A reflex. My life had been full of such unbilled services. When the ushers closed the doors and the bells resolved into silence, the city seemed to hold its breath. The first speaker offered the public shape of Victor Blake, partner at Blake & Rowe, patron of the Arts Advisory Board this, and Capital Campaign that. Stories of ribbon cuttings, photographs of groundbreakings. The words had polish. They moved like a limousine. I listened for the invisible rooms, the winter nights with ledger columns and space heaters, the morning I sold a sapphire ring to make Evan's tuition deposit, the smell of chicken broth cooling when he came home from another late meeting. In the litany, I was a pronoun that never arrived. My son stood next to dark suit, drawing hard lines on his shoulders. Evan had grown into a tone made for conference calls, neutral, efficient, persuasive, without showing its hand. He thanked the firm, the congregation, the friends who had flown in. Then he said there was one more person to acknowledge, someone who had kept his father steady through some very difficult years. The church did not move, but I felt every face adjust. I waited for the simple word that still reaches a mother. He did not use it. "Thank you, Sloan Hart," Evan said, "for being there for my father when it mattered." I knew the name. Everyone did if they read program notes or gala lists. Sloan stood in a red cashmere coat that burned against the black attire around her. She dabbed at her eyelashes with a linen square, a gesture designed to look smaller than it was. She had once been an assistant, then a consultant, then a presence. She nodded toward my son with an economy that suggested practice. I kept my face arranged. People mistook a steady face for composure, and I had learned to accept the misunderstanding. The organ slid into a hymn. Outside, the fog brightened a fraction as if noon were making promises it couldn't keep. When the final amen settled, the air filled with handshakes. Palms found mine, eyes did not. "He did so much for the city," someone said. "A great loss," said another. They pressed their sympathy into my fingers like claim checks, and I smiled so they could feel that their errand had been completed. Sloan moved through the throng as if the aisle were water and she the practiced swimmer. Evan stepped beside her to accept condolences, their shoulders aligned by accident or design. I did not approach either of them. There are forms of dignity that are only visible to the person keeping them. Outside, the fog lifted into a tin sky. The wind at the corner of Warwick and 52nd cut through the seams of Victor's coat and slid beneath my blouse, finding the hollow below my collarbone. I walked to the low stone wall that bordered the church lawn and sat for a moment, the program limp in my lap. Someone dropped a set of keys in the lot. The clatter rang like small bells. I folded the coat across my knees and watched the doors. Clusters of mourners dispersed toward cars. A woman I recognized from the museum board touched my arm and said, "I always admired your grace," then hurried away without waiting for an answer. The word grace hung in the air like a compliment that meant obedience. When I finally stood, the world had returned to its routine traffic lights, ticking pigeons fussing at the curb, a bus sighing as it knelt for passengers. In a day built to make grief legible, something else had been written. Not a eulogy, not quite a scandal. The city would remember a man and the woman who steadied him. There would be no slot in the program for the person who set out bowls. I placed the tissues back in my purse. My hands shook once and then stopped. The sky had the color of sheet metal. I did not look back at the doors again. I crossed the wet street and began to walk home, careful with the curbs as if the ground might shift under a name that no one had spoken. By late afternoon, the funeral program had curled at the corners inside my bag, as if the paper knew how quickly dignity warps under damp air. I pressed it flat on the hall table and put my keys beside it. The card from the attorney's office lay where the florist's note had sat the week before. I read the address again as if repetition could steady a hand. At 3, I took the elevator to the 12th floor of Kellerman and Pierce and watched my reflection climb through a pane of glass that made everyone look employed and certain. The conference room felt like the inside of a jewelry box, dark wood velvet hush, a line of blinds casting measured stripes across the carpet. The senior partner introduced himself, a man whose voice had been trained to remove weather from any remark. Evan was already seated near the head of the table, spine straight, fingers laced. He nodded when I entered, the kind of nod that keeps peace at a meeting. On the far side nearer the window sat Sloane Hart in a navy sheath and an expression polished to high shine. Her red coat hung over the back of a chair, a flag lowered to half-mast. The attorney cleared his throat. Pursuant to the last will and testament of Victor Avery, Blake executed 3 years prior. He spoke with the cadence of an instrument that had been tuned and tuned again. Even grief bent to it. He read the first disposition, the house on Brookside Avenue, with contents and improvements. He read the second, the lodge on Table Rock Lake, including boat slip and fixtures. He read the third, the retirement and brokerage accounts enumerated in Schedule B. He paused so that the language could fall where it would. To Miss Haba. When Hart, he concluded in fee simple and free of encumbrance, with any residuary assets not otherwise designated to be managed by Ms. Hart as primary beneficiary. The blinds might as well have been bars. The words had traveled a smooth corridor and arrived without scuffing their shoes. I felt the chair under me and the weight of Victor's coat on my lap. "Excuse me," I said, and the room turned slightly in my direction, as if the building itself had been nudged. The attorney adjusted his glasses and read again from the page, the same phrases landing in the same order, resistant to the human reaction they produced. I looked to my son. Evan kept his eyes forward, the way people do when a simple cube of fact is sliding into place and they intend to let it. "You knew," I said, not a question so much as a shape made of air. He exhaled once, a breath that did not tremble. "Dad had his reasons," he answered. Sloane understood him. She kept him steady. Sloane's chin lifted in inch, acknowledgement calibrated to suggest modesty. A silver pen lay before her, and she aligned it with the edge of a legal pad as if straightness could prevent spill. The attorney resumed small provisions, bequests to a scholarship fund, a painting designated to the museum, all details that lay flat now that the architecture had been revealed. When it was over, the partner thanked us for coming in as if kindness could be made of phrasing. Evan stood first. He touched the chair back, but not my shoulder. "I'll call you later," he said, which is a sentence designed to tidy a moment. Sloane slipped her arms into the red coat and glanced at me with the faintest smile of condolence, a signature trained for lobbies and foyers. I kept my hands around my bag straps until my knuckles pressed S-shapes into the leather. Outside, the corridor smelled faintly of carpet cleaner. I rode the elevator down with a courier and a woman balancing a tray of pastries for some meeting where sugar might smooth a quarterly report. On the ground floor, the revolving door solved my exit. At home, the light in the front room had lost its will. I set the coat on the entry bench and hung my purse on the hook that had learned its job years ago. The house was in the same order I'd left it, which felt like evidence that a human life can be dusted and placed back on a shelf. I opened the closet and slid Victor's coat into the line of darker wool. The cedar blocks gave up their soft breath. His hats made a tidy skyline on the shelf, city of someone who never again would need to check the weather. The kitchen remembered chicken broth and coffee. The refrigerator hummed at the same pitch it had used yesterday and the day before, a loyal machine. I took a glass to the sink and watched the faucet fill it as if the body could be engineered to accept steadiness through water. Then I put the glass down and began to open drawers. Top left. Rubber bands, wine keys, a screwdriver that never returned to the basement. Top right, recipe cards with Victor's notes about salt, the handwriting businesslike even when appetite was the subject. Second drawer, warranties, appliance manuals. The kinds of papers that make neat piles by being flat. I moved to the dining room and unlatched the sideboard. Napkins, candlesticks, a small box that used to contain place cards but now held old receipts folded into triangles. Under the stack, I found an envelope with a Marina logo and a postmark smudged to gray. It was addressed to Ms. Sloane Hart, care of a property manager near Table Rock Lake, 7 summers ago. Inside lay a bill for slip rental, electricity, and maintenance line items specific enough to dress a picture. The lodge had always felt like wood and water and ease. I looked at the figure due and the date paid. The number was not large, its meaning was. I carried the envelope to the dining table and set it down as you would place a fragile thing. A photograph slipped from a folder clipped behind the sideboard drawer, a charity gala at the Nelson Atkins Victor in a tuxedo that never learned to be tired, Sloane beside him. Her hair arranged as if motion were a decision she allowed. In the margin in Victor's hand, a sentence, "Someday we'll make it official." The script had the firm strokes of an architect, lines without apology. I took the picture by one corner, the way museum guides tell you to hold drawings, and stood there for a count of 8 the way nurses taught me to steady a breath during blood work. My thumb left a warmth on the glossy paper that quickly cooled. The house hummed in its modest way. Somewhere outside, a delivery truck ground a gear. I put the photo beside the marina bill. 2 objects 3 rooms apart had chosen each other. I turned the candlesticks so their bases aligned and sat down in the chair that had always been mine. The chandelier above threw a subdued circle on the wood, the light that dining rooms prefer pretend evening even at 4. Across the street, the Whitakers' storm door opened and closed. I crossed with the envelope in my coat pocket, stepping carefully over the ridges the city leaves when it patches a winter crack. Mrs. Whitaker answered in her cardigan, her hair set for the week. She was a woman who had opinions about tomato blight and music programs. We had traded shortbread recipes the year Evan left for college. We had traded looks across sidewalks when late deliveries caused late dinners. "I won't keep you," I said. "Do you remember Victor ever having guests at the lodge when I was out of town?" She thickened her mouth, a gesture she used while trying to place a date. "Well, he took people down sometimes. Staff clients. One December, he and that PR woman Sloan as it were here with a ladder and a box of lights helping put up the Whitaker display. I assumed she was some cousin or a decorator. She tapped a knuckle against the door jamb. That was the winter you were in St. Louis with your sister's surgery, wasn't it?" I thanked her. She apologized for forgetting to send gingerbread at Christmas. I told her she hadn't. Gifts are like weather in a neighborhood. The memory of them keeps even when the thing itself does not arrive. Inside my house again, I pulled the envelope and the photograph from my pocket and set them in the middle of the table. They changed the room, not in volume, not in furniture, but in temperature, as though a window had been opened in a wall I hadn't known held air. The pattern was modest and unafraid, a bill to a woman for a place that had a boat slip a note on a photograph that did not require decoding a neighbor's memory, located cleanly in winter. The edge of the marina envelope lifted where the glue had given up over time. I smoothed it with a fingertip. I walked to the kitchen and returned with a manila folder, wrote Brookside Household on the tab, then crossed out household and wrote records. I slid the bill and the photo inside, closed the metal prongs, and pressed them flat. In the sideboard drawer, I found a pad of yellow paper. I wrote down the dates, the names, short words, only the kind a person could read standing up. By evening, the streetlights had feathered the window with pale ladders. I left the folder in the center of the table and turned off the chandelier. The room kept its circle of light for a breath and then let it go. I stood in the threshold long enough for the darkness to settle into a shape I could call familiar. In the entry, Victor's hat hung on its hook, patient object. I touched the brim out of habit and for the first time all day felt my hand return to me with something it had taken. I did not speak aloud. The house could not answer and the good plates had nothing useful to add. I went to the sink, washed my glass, placed it upside down on a towel and listened to the drip tap into quiet. Then I turned back toward the dining room and glanced at the folder, a small rectangle holding paper that had learned how to weigh more than it should. It would be there in the morning. It was there now. Morning made the folder look smaller than it had the night before. Sun came shallow through the blinds and laid pale ladders across the dining table. I moved the chair in by a hand's width, opened the metal prongs, and set the marina bill where I could read the dates without squinting. Coffee helped only as far as heat goes. The facts had their own temperature. I turned on the laptop at the end of the table, the one Victor insisted we buy when Evan started business school because household systems should be current. The machine hummed awake with the patience of an appliance. I searched the Jackson County property portal and then ran a wider net clay plat, though I did not know exactly what I hoped to catch. Sloan's name came up first on a condo near the plaza, a place with balconies like tidy shelves. Then another listing appeared farther west, a single-family villa stucco, the color of cream scraped from a bottle. The transfer date sat in unblinking numbers 2 weeks after a client trip that had taken Victor 3 days and 1 expensive tie. I clicked through the deed. The seller was a family trust. The buyer Sloan Hart, a signature looped with confident speed. The financing was simple, the price was not. My mouth went dry in a way that water couldn't fix. I wrote the parcel number on the yellow pad and boxed it once. I boxed the date twice. I told myself to stay inside nouns and verbs. Adjectives would tilt the room. The browser sat open like a door, so I walked through. The museum's gala page kept a public archive. The Nelson Atkins had learned to court donors with permanence. There was Victor on a dais 2 years back, tuxedo shoulders square. Sloan on the far edge of the frame, turned 3/4 as if the camera were a thing she allowed. Her caption, reposted from the museum's account, was the sort that means to be modest and manages instead to be permanent. Grateful to boost the arts with good men who build beautiful cities. I scrolled each photo a square window that let in curated air. On Sloane's Instagram, which stayed unlocked like a showroom, I found a December post, a tree trimmed to the discipline of an architect. Victor stood beside it in the blazer I had given him for our 25th Navy, with the silent check seams smooth as a vow. His hand was in his pocket. He looked at ease in a room that had learned his weight. Sloane's caption, "His grin is my paycheck." Comments stacked like confetti hearts claps the names of people we used to nod to from across a lobby. I set the laptop back a few inches and breathed. You can be hurt and still be honest about what papers say. That discipline proved itself in ledger columns long before it had to serve here. By 9, Rosa had answered my text with 3 words and a pin drop. Come by now. She lived in a brick duplex a mile down Brookside, a place with succulents lined up like a conference call on her kitchen sill. We had met when Blake & Rowe hired her old firm to do a third-party review during a lean year. She had the gift of speaking numbers in plain English. When the partners drifted toward conclusions that favored a story, she pulled them back with decimals. She opened the door before I knocked twice and waved me to the table. You look like a person who already knows, she said, not unkind. I set the folder down, slid out the marina bill and the photograph, then turned the laptop so she could see the county screen. Rosa did not rush the pages. She read the bill, noted the date, the slip number, the property manager. She angled the photograph to the window and stared at Victor's handwriting for a count that I recognized from my own rituals. He wrote this at speed, she said, not ashamed of the verb. She tapped the caption on the gallery post with a fingernail. People curate their lies. They also curate their truths without knowing it. She opened her own laptop and typed as if her fingers were stating facts. Blake & Rowe's vendor list still lives on a server that no one outside IT remembers, she said. You're not here and I'm not here. She smiled once brittle. If anyone asks, we're discussing church bake sales. The name came up sooner than my hope had planned for it, North Star Advisors, LLC. I knew it only as a constellation. On the screen, it was a series of invoices, clean, identical, a sameness that served like perfume. Rosa pinched to zoom. See the header? The address is a registered agent suite, not an office. No phone beyond a voicemail. No staff in the state employment database. She opened a second window and pulled Form 990s for the Blake & Rowe Foundation. There she said, tapping a schedule with an accountant's affection. PR retainer. Description vague enough to pass at a glance. What were they billing, I asked. Strategy, brand positioning. Stakeholder mapping, reputation management. She read each phrase, landing like a feather that weighed a brick. No deliverables attached. The invoices are dated just outside the annual audit cycle. That's a pattern, not an accident. She traced a finger down a column of amounts, 50, 80, 45 quiet numbers that added without raising a voice. Over 6 years, they built to something rude. My mind arrived at the total a breath before her mouth said it. The air changed shape in my chest. Rosa saw it and lowered her voice a half step. Misappropriation, she said, not as a diagnosis yet, but as a working theory. Self-dealing if they routed it through the foundation to blur origin and intent. She opened Missouri's business registry and searched North Star. The registered agent was a law office that offered anonymity by the month. She clicked through UCC filings with the patience of a gardener. Here, she said, a security interest 2 years ago with a local lender collateral listed as accounts receivable and future income streams. And look, someone guaranteed the note. Not on the face, but the writer lists a personal email domain I can tie to Sloane. She wanted the line to look independent, but didn't trust the cash flow. I watched her move across screens with the economy of a person who had taught herself to be exact. The line items settled into a grid, and the grid began to suggest an architecture money leaving the firm by a door labeled PR, entering a shell that never raised its voice, then finding a home where Victor looked rested and Sloane looked photographed. Rosa slid the marina bill back toward me with 2 fingers. This is mundane, she said, and that's good. Fraud loses when ordinary paper speaks. A slip fee and a light bill date the relationship at least 7 years back. The deed pushes 5, the invoices cover 6. Patterns love neighbors. We worked the rest of the morning in a quiet that wasn't exactly comfortable but felt right for the task. Rosa printed copies and highlighted, not with neon, but with a pencil, gray marks that let the paper keep its dignity. She showed me the small repetitions, the typo that lived in every North Star invoice, the way the number 4 dropped below the line in the totals, the date format that ignored commas. Whoever generated these didn't care about variation, she said. Consistency is their tell. At noon, she warmed soup and pushed a bowl toward me. I ate out of obedience to blood sugar. What do I do with this? I asked, finally, the words heavier than the spoon. It's more than ugly, she said. But what it is exactly, a court will have to say. You need counsel who knows how to peel shells without tearing the meat. She wrote a name off the corner of my yellow pad, Naomi Price. She tried a case for a client of mine, family trust hijacked by a consultant who learned the passwords. Naomi doesn't posture, she builds. Rosa reached across the table and tapped the Marina logo once. Bring the quiet papers. They hold better on the stand than heroics. On my way home, Brookside felt like a street that preferred order and could forgive most things if you kept your hedges even. I turned the radio on and off, then left it off. At a red light, I watched a boy balance on a curb with his arms out like wings and thought of Evan on the low stone wall outside St. Mark's the year he was 8. How he had made a performance of not falling and then laughed so hard when he did. I let the light go green without moving and absorbed one honk as I settled back into traffic. In the kitchen, I washed Rosa's pencil dust off my fingers, then transferred the copies to a manila envelope. The house had not changed, though I had placed a name on one of its shadows. The entry bench held Victor's coat. I slid my hand into a pocket without thinking and found a receipt the cleaners had left last spring. It listed 2 trousers and 1 sport coat pressed. The cash register had stamped the date crooked. I put it with the others, not because it mattered, but because paper makes company. At the dining table, I laid the documents out and arranged them by date. The grid reasserted itself. Slip fee, deed, invoices in a monthly march that stepped wide around auditors, foundation payments pretexted by PR, a security agreement that promised a future built on yesterday's misdirection, Instagram posts like glossy labels slapped on a box I already knew the contents of. On a separate sheet, I wrote the nouns that no one could argue with Marina Deed invoice, 9990 UCC. Then I wrote the verbs that moved them, billed, transferred, routed, guaranteed. I kept the adjectives to myself. I opened my laptop again, found the website for Price and Hollis, and read the short biography of Naomi Price. The photo showed a woman in her 50s with eyes that looked like they had seen a long table from both ends. The last line of the page was a sentence that had the sound of something she said out loud once, and someone typed up because it stayed true the second time justice isn't found, it's built. I dialed the number under the sentence. A receptionist answered with the neutral warmth that keeps things from sounding like bad news. When she asked the nature of my call, I said corporate misappropriation connected to a will. There are phrases that feel too large for a mouth. It still fit. Can you email what you have, she asked. Not originals. Scans are fine. I can, I said. Ms. Price has a late afternoon window if you're available to come by, she added. 4:30. I thanked her, hung up, and moved the printer closer to the edge of the sideboard. The scanner light traveled under each page like a plane over a dark field. I watched the green bar inch and stop and return, methodical as a nurse. When the last page joined the file, I named it with the caution of a person who finally trusted labels. I attached the document to an email that did not use adjectives and pressed send. The house held its breath briefly while the progress bar finished. Then the machine chimed the unobtrusive note it assigns to completion. I stacked the originals, slid them back into the envelope, and placed the envelope inside my bag. I washed the single coffee cup, turned it upside down on a towel, and wiped the table in one slow pass that left the wood a shade darker until it dried. Outside, the day had shed its thin sun for a flatter light. The mail truck squeaked and stopped. A child called to another across the sidewalk. A dog barked without urgency. I put my coat on and stood for a moment with my hand on the doorknob. The folder inside my bag pressed gently against my hip. Paper doesn't weigh much, it still changes how you walk. The courthouse on 12th Street rose like a solved problem square, indifferent, heavier than anyone's idea of fairness. I arrived a few minutes before the docket and followed the stream of jackets through the metal detectors. The air held the sober smell of floor polish and damp winter coats. Naomi met me in the hallway outside Division 9, a slim folder under her arm and a pen tucked into the coil of her hair as if there might be a quiz. You brought the originals, she asked. In the bag, I said. Good. We'll mark copies. Originals rest unless the judge wants to feel paper. She glanced at my face. Breathe from the bottom of your ribs. In there, short answers win. Reporters lined one wall, pens already out because pens pretend to be neutral. Sloan arrived with her attorney, a man whose tie looked like an argument. Her hair was pinned clean. The red coat had been replaced by navy that could pass in any room. Evan walked in behind them and chose a bench 2 rows back, close enough to be counted, far enough to be untouchable. He didn't see me, or he decided not to. The bailiff called the room to order. The judge took the bench 60s spare, the kind of gaze that had watched 100 storms blow in and out and never once mistaken thunder for rain. Blake v. Hart, the clerk read. Matters concerning disputed testamentary dispositions and alleged corporate misappropriation. Sloane's lawyer rose first. He had been practicing that posture his whole adult life. Your Honor, he began. Ms. Hart provided legitimate strategic consulting through North Star Advisors. Mr. Blake, a sophisticated principal, retained her services for years with full awareness of scope. The will reflects his clear testamentary intent. We caution the court against recasting professional loyalty as misconduct because grief wants a villain. He slid a binder forward for the judge. Tabs, summaries, words arranged to sound like rails that would not bend. Naomi stood as if standing were the most natural way to talk. Your Honor will let the documents carry most of the weight. She lifted our first exhibit. North Star invoice 0041. You'll find the same header font and misspelling receivable across 5 years. She turned one page. No street office. Registered agent suite only. No staff. No website. No deliverables attached. She set the invoice beside a page from the Foundation's Form 990. Here's the Foundation's disbursement schedule describing a PR retainer in the same amounts on a timetable that keeps one step ahead of the annual audit. That is not management, that is choreography. The judge looked down through her reading glasses. The totals, $1.1 million over 6 years, Naomi said, flowing from firm and Foundation to North Star and from North Star into accounts linked to Ms. Hart. Sloan's attorney objected to the phrase linked. Foundation support for messaging is routine, he said. And North Star's accounts are private. Counsel is speculating. Naomi didn't color. We'll stick to nouns then. She turned a second tab. UCC1 financing statement filed 2 years ago, collateral listed as accounts receivable and future income. Writer includes an email domain used by Ms. Hart in other contracts. The security interest shows that North Star depended on predictable cash flow from a single client, Mr. Blake's universe. The judge lifted a brow. And the relationship between Ms. Hart and the decedent. Counsel wants to reduce it to loyalty, Naomi said. We're not here to grade feelings, but we have dated evidence that contextualizes the flow. Exhibit 4 Marina statement billed to Ms. Hart's name for the lodge slip 7 summers back. Exhibit 5 deed records for a West Side villa purchased by Ms. Hart 2 weeks after a Blake client trip. Exhibit 6, a contemporaneous photograph bearing the decedent's handwriting. Someday we'll make it official. The paper trail doesn't need adjectives to cohere. The judge nodded once. A small economy. Proceed. Naomi called Rosa. Rosa wore a blouse the color of ink. She swore in and sat the kind of witness who doesn't mind silence because silence leaves room for facts. Ms. Delgado, Naomi said, what do the invoices tell you as a forensic accountant when you look at them in sequence? They tell me someone did not expect to be asked. Twice? Rosa said. She explained the Cadence monthly invoices posted just outside audit periods, consistent typos, date formats that ignored commas, $4s that dipped below the line as if the key were loose. She traced the matching numbers from the Foundation's filings to North Star's billings. She kept her verbs tight billed, posted, transferred. Sloan's lawyer tried to soften the grid. Ms. Delgado, you understand that messaging is intangible. Deliverables might be memos, meetings, hallway advice. Intangibles still leave calendars and emails, Rosa said. These invoices show nothing. And the Foundation's minutes reflect no campaigns. If counsel wants to call hallway advice $1 million retainer, the hallway should have a better ledger. A murmur went through the back bench. The judge cleared her throat not for effect, but to remind air how to behave. Naomi called me. I walked to the stand, aware of the floor under the soles of my shoes. The oath tasted like cold water. I sat and folded my hands and looked at Naomi's left shoulder because looking at eyes invites stories. Mrs. Blake. Naomi said softly, how long were you married? 41 years. During those years, did you work for pay? Not after Evan was born, I said. Victor liked the house to run on time. I kept accounts. Cooked. He called it the family back office. Did you contribute financially in other ways? I sold a sapphire ring when tuition was due. We were between draws. I kept the heat low. Every winter the firm was lean. Did you know of North Star Advisors at the time those payments occurred? No. Did you know Ms. Hart? Naomi asked. I knew her name. Thank you. Naomi turned to the judge. We won't ask the witness to fill any holes that paper can fill for us. Sloan's counsel cross-examined me politely like a person who'd learned to decorate harm. Mrs. Blake, you attended events with your husband. You saw Ms. Hart in professional settings. I did. And your husband authorized payments from his company. You weren't a partner. You had no authority over budget decisions. I did not have authority, I said. Your husband also executed a will 3 years ago. Yes, he asked. I learned that yesterday, I said. And that will validly executed left certain assets to my client. That is the decedent's expressed intent. He sat satisfied with the geometry of his questions. Intent is a word lawyers trust. Naomi rose with a slim, pale folder. Your Honor, we move to admit Exhibit 9. She glanced at me. I knew the paper without touching it. A prior draft of Mr. Blake's will found in a locked safe at the Blake & Rowe shop and certified by the clerk's office last week. The document includes a safeguard clause concerning fraud contamination of downstream dispositions. The language states that if distributions are tainted by fraud or misappropriation, all disputed assets revert to the spouse of record. Sloane's lawyer was on his feet. Objection, relevance, drafts are not wills, they're noise. Naomi didn't look up. We offer it not to replace the later will, but to illuminate intent when fraud infects the later instrument. The clause doesn't invent a remedy, it memorializes the decedent's wish not to reward theft. The judge asked to see the page. She read quietly and then out loud flat as a readback. In the event any bequest herein is shown by competent evidence to have been induced by or funded through fraud, misappropriation, or embezzlement from any entity under my control, said bequest shall fail and the affected assets shall vest in my spouse of record. She set the paper down and looked at Sloane's counsel. You're welcome to argue around that sentence, counselor, but it is English. He tried. He spoke of drafts as brainstorming of the final will as the only voice that counts of seasoned executives making hard calls with imperfect optics. He described Sloane's role in terms that made her sound like a seatbelt. He kept turning back to the idea that Victor chose. Naomi did not chase adjectives. He chose, she said, and he chose inside a system he helped rig. A person may sign a will with clear eyes and still leave a gift that cannot stand because it rests on stolen footing. We're not here to fix grief. We're here to repair the floor. The judge asked a few questions that were not quite questions: how many invoices, how many years, whether anyone from the foundation ever described a campaign beyond reputation. She wrote a note I could not see. Then she removed her glasses and set them down like a gavel that would wait its turn. I'll rule now, she said. The room stilled the way rooms do when they realize nothing useful can be said. The court finds, she began, that invoices submitted by North Star advisors are unsubstantiated and exhibit indicia of fabrication, repeated formatting, recurring typographical errors, absence of deliverables, and timing designed to avoid standard review. Funds totaling approximately $1.1 million were misdirected from Blake & Rowe and its affiliated foundation into accounts associated with Ms. Hart. That pattern constitutes misappropriation. She turned one page. Because the later will's bequests to Ms. Hart are inseparable from the financial misconduct that underwrote them, those provisions are tainted and fail. The prior draft's safeguard clause, while not operative as a will, is persuasive of the decedent's intent not to bless theft. Accordingly, the disputed assets revert to the spouse of record, Mrs. Eleanor Blake. Ms. Hart is ordered to disgorge misappropriated funds with interest. The sound that followed was not applause and not outrage. It was the sound of people recalculating. Sloane's face held together for 3 heartbeats and then cracked at the corners. Her attorney leaned in close and formed a tent with his hands. Evans stared at the front rail as if letters might rearrange themselves into a kinder decision if he refused to blink. The judge stood. We're adjourned. Reporters moved as if released by a rubber band. Naomi touched my elbow once, not for show. We'll paper the order and monitor repayment, she said. You don't have to talk to anyone. I nodded. The word repayment sat in the air without satisfaction. Money doesn't apologize. It moves back to the column where it belongs and waits for someone to add it up. In the aisle, Sloane rose slow, deliberate, a performer exiting before the curtain remembers it can fall. Evan stepped toward her and offered an arm. She took it. They passed within 2 feet of me. My son's eyes went to the floor and then to the door, careful steps as if the building might punish haste. He did not lift his head. Outside, the afternoon was a flat pane of light. The wind came down the government plaza and bent neckties. Paper cones from a food truck skittered to the curb. I stood on the granite steps and felt the folder against my ribs, where I had pressed it out of habit. Naomi said something about certified copies and timelines, then squeezed my shoulder and went to recess her own day back into order. I walked to the edge of the plaza and stopped beside a bare tree anchored in a concrete ring. The bark felt like a language I could almost read. Cars moved in patient rows. A siren tried itself and then changed its mind. I put the folder under my arm and straightened Victor's coat because cloth remembers the person who cared for it and mistakes that for presence. Across the street, a man fumbled his keys and laughed at himself. The sound didn't travel far. I thought about the way rooms looked when you turned off a chandelier, the light held in its circle for a breath before it gave up. I had things again with my name on them, a house that had learned my footsteps, a lake place with a slip that would not invoice strangers' accounts that would return to columns I could balance. These were facts. I stood until the wind found the hollow at my throat. Then I stepped off the curb and crossed toward the parking garage, the folder still against my side, the day doing the quiet work. Days do after someone says a thing out loud that was already true. 2 winters slid past and left their salt on the curbs. The gossip pages found other faces. The court order turned into a routine statements, arriving transfers, recorded a ledger, clicking back into balance, one quiet line at a time. The house on Brookside adjusted to my footsteps the way a dog settles after circling twice on a rug. The lodge contract came up for renewal with my name alone. The marina clerk wrote, "Welcome back" on the receipt, then forgot to keep calling me ma'am. On paper, things made sense. Paper is very good at that. Evan did not call. Holidays smoothed themselves over with manageable lies. He's traveling. He caught something. Next time for sure. The lies were so polite that they hurt less than the truth would have. I learned how to set a table for one without turning it into a gesture. I put flowers on the sideboard sometimes and sometimes not. When my father died in March, the cold had begun to lift, the way an old stain lightens in wash water. We gathered in Des Moines, at a small church that smelled of lemon oil and coffee. The program paper was thin enough to fold with one hand. I stood near the casket and smoothed the edge of the satin because hands want work. "Mom," someone said behind me. I turned and found my son. He looked like a photograph that had spent a season in the sun, faded a little at the edges, too much white in the eyes. He said my name again, and then he didn't talk for a moment as if words were currency he had been living without. "I was wrong," he said finally. He didn't go for the speech that explains everything. He kept the nouns close. I defended the version of Dad that fit me. Sloan made that version easy. We stood with our elbows almost touching two people who had learned to keep still in rooms that wanted movement. He swallowed and tried again. "You carried the rest. I see it now." I did not touch his face. You don't pet a skittish animal. You let it decide. After the service, we walked into my father's small yard, where the grass still lay low from winter and the hose remembered its coil. The lilac by the fence had almost died last year. I had cut it back to sticks and then left it ugly and doubtful. March air moved through what was left like a hand testing a curtain. Evan stopped beside it and glanced at the bare canes. "You kept it," he said. "It owed me one," I said. "Last spring I almost dug it out. Then June came and it put out more blooms than it had any right to." He reached and touched a twig the way you touch a wrist before taking a pulse. The wood held a little life under the bark if you knew to press for it. He looked up. "I don't know how to fix everything," he said. His voice was lower than his father's had ever been. "I can show up." We sat on the back steps with paper cups of church coffee cooling between our hands. He told me small pieces of the last 2 years. The way loyalty can feel like a room where the door sticks. The way silence multiplies when you refuse to name it. He said he had found an old photo of the three of us at a county fair. Evan on Victor's shoulders, me looking past the camera because I was counting tickets. "You were there," he said, like a person noticing water in a picture of a river. I told him about the marina clerk and the lodge stairs that still creaked on the third tread. I did not mention legal words. They can live in files where they belong. We watched a squirrel test a stretch of fence and fail at grace, which made both of us laugh once short and honest. He offered to carry the flower arrangements to the car. He took the heavier one without performing. At the trunk he turned as if checking a measurement. "Do you want breakfast tomorrow?" he asked. I said yes because the word fit. He nodded, and the nod had no conference room in it. The wind shifted and ran a clean hand through the yard. The lilac held still but not stubbornly. It is easy to read a plant as a promise, easier to let it be a plant living ugly in winter generous when it can afford it. When the last cousin left and the church women reclaimed their pans, I stood in the doorway and watched Evan talk with the funeral director about invoices, his shoulders rounded the way a man's will if he is doing something ordinary and useful. A child chased a balloon toward the sidewalk and caught the string before it reached the street triumph without witness. On the drive back to Kansas City, the highway unspooled its gray ribbon without offering metaphors. I stopped once for coffee I didn't need and sat in the parked car with the lid warming my palm. The thought came plain and stayed. I was not a figure in someone else's caption. The house would be lit when I got there because I had left a lamp on in the hallway. The coat on the hook was just cloth. I had things to put away and a breakfast to keep. Back home, the lilacs behind my own fence showed nothing yet, but the branches bent and didn't break under my thumb. I tipped water into a vase and set it on the kitchen counter because flowers would arrive soon enough and a vase is allowed to wait. The rooms had their old shapes and a new quiet. I stood there between the sink and the table, the ordinary place where a person lives when she has finished explaining herself to rooms, and let the light turn one shade softer before evening found it. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.